Now that we've had a chance to talk about some of the basic concepts that come up in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, let's look at the actual text itself. We're going to begin our discussion of Coleridge's Biographia Literaria by looking at a point fairly early in the text, which appears on page 495 of the Norton Anthology from chapter 4. This is chapter 4 of the Biographia, where he first acknowledges the distinction between the fancy and the imagination. In chapter 4, he makes a distinction between the fancy and the imagination. After looking at Wordsworth's poetry and attempting to discover what makes Wordsworth's poetry special, he comes to the conclusion that fancy and the imagination are, as he says, two distinct and widely different faculties, instead of being, according to the general belief, either two names with one meaning or, at further, the lower and higher degree of one and the same power. He acknowledges immediately after that it's common to see them as the same thing, and that, in fact, the original words from which they come, from Greek and Latin, could easily be seen as synonyms. But he has drawn the conclusion from studying Wordsworth, which he then exemplifies by comparing two earlier poets, that the imagination and fancy are different. He says below that Milton had a highly imaginative, Cooley a very fanciful mind. And if he characterized Milton, he would confine the term to imagination, while the other, Cooley, he would say has poetry that exemplifies the fancy. Cooley is an 18th century poet, Milton a very famous 17th century poet, one of the greatest poets in the English language. And so he's going to make a distinction about what the difference is between imagination and fancy. And later in chapter 13, on page 496, this appears, he starts to create a taxonomy of the imagination, describing the differences. So he says, and this is a very famous passage from the Biographia, probably the most famous, and if in the future you encounter the Biographia again, this is a passage that you're likely to see selected. He says, the imagination, then, I consider either as primary or secondary. Okay, so he's going to be talking first about what the primary imagination is. He says, the primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception. This is not specifically a power that is confined to poets. All humans perceive, Coleridge says, through the imagination. It is an essentially creative act, but it's something that belongs to all people in their perception. And it is, he says, a repetition in the finite mind, that would be the mind of the individual human, of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I Am. I Am is the English translation of the Hebrew term Yahweh. In other words, the eternal act of creation in the infinite I Am would be God. So it is the echo in the individual human mind of God's continuous act of creation. I am is the statement that Coleridge has been using as the basis of his logical reasoning, leading him to the point where he is able to assert that imagination is able to perceive reality. So, for Coleridge, the primary imagination is the power of human perception, which is essentially creative, echoing the act of God's creation. On the other hand, the secondary imagination is an echo of the former. The former would be the primary imagination. However, it coexists with the conscious will. In other words, that you have control over the secondary imagination. The primary imagination is what would be like an autonomous reaction. It's something that takes place on its own. You don't have any control over it. It simply happens when you perceive. But the secondary imagination is one that you can decide to switch on and off. It's something over which one has control, and it's something that the poets use. It's still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency and differing only in degree and the mode of its operation. So it's still a creative power, like the primary imagination. However, differs in degree. It's a somewhat secondary. It's a lower power, and it operates differently. He says it dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate, or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still in all events it struggles to idealize and unify. Now, this is the secondary imagination. Keep this in mind, because later when he talks about what makes a poem is something that will be integrated into an organic whole. And clearly, even though in the next chapter, chapter 14, he doesn't clearly distinguish when the primary imagination and when the secondary imagination kick in, because he does describe the imagination as creating this organic whole by breaking down the distinctions between differences. Clearly, the secondary imagination is that thing that one uses to create the poem out of the materials furnished by the primary imagination. The primary imagination is the power of human perception. The secondary imagination is the power that takes the materials provided by that perception and integrates them into a unified organic whole, which ultimately will become the poet. Both forms of the imagination is essentially vital. The word vital is an important word for the Romantics, will also be an important word for Carlyle. Vital means giving life, vitality, it gives life. Even as objects, all objects are essentially fixed and dead. So objects in themselves are dead, they have no meaning. In the philosophical school known as phenomenology, it is the study of things in themselves, things divorced from the way we see things. It is what things are as they exist in themselves. And of course, it's impossible to see the thing in itself, because every individual always sees things through their own preconceptions, through their own beliefs and knowledge. Even the most innocent object, the objects are always seen through perception and always filtered through the medium of our perception and our imagination. Objects themselves are fixed and dead. The poet enlivens the object through his perception, and that's why the imagination is vital. It's why it gives life to things themselves fixed and dead. The fancy, though, and this is the distinction between the imagination and the fancy, on the other hand, doesn't really give life to things. It's a warehouse of past perceptions. Remember our earlier discussion of fantasy and the sense that it is really simply providing memories of past perceptions, that the phantasm, as Shelley will say later, is simply a memory of a past perception. The fancy is simply a warehouse that has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. It's no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space and blended with and modified the empirical phenomena of the will, which we express by the word choice. In other words, the fancy is simply us pulling out memories of past sensual perceptions from our mind and reproducing them. So if we apply this to his earlier discussion of the difference between Milton and Cooley, Milton has an imagination that gives life to fixed and dead objects. Cooley simply catalogs objects. Inferior poetry simply uses the fancy. It simply gives us objects as objects, fixed and dead. It becomes a catalog of objects. Whereas an imaginative poet, a true poet, is someone whose imagination is able to give life to those objects. So once again, the primary imagination is the mode of human perception. The secondary imagination is the faculty exercised by the will with the intention of the poet in order to break things apart and reunify them into organic wholes, primarily in the form of a poem or other artworks. And the fancy simply reproduces a catalog of previous memories and doesn't enliven them in any way. In chapter 14 now, he's going to start talking about the way Wordsworth uses his imagination to, as remember in the preface, Wordsworth says that throw over them a certain coloring of the imagination. And Coleridge is repeating that idea where he says that Mr. Wordsworth is able to excite the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature and the power of giving interest of novelty by the modifying colors of the imagination. So this is the imagination working. And he isn't making it clear whether he's talking about the primary or secondary imagination. In chapter 14, he doesn't continue that clear distinction. But if we study how he describes it, we can see how the primary and secondary imagination work. In order to better understand the concepts of the primary and secondary imagination, it's helpful to look at the corresponding concepts of poetry and the poem, which Coleridge discusses farther down in this chapter. After a discussion of the original plan for lyrical ballads and why Coleridge pulls out, a discussion of the popular response to Wordsworth's poems, and particularly of the distinctions between Coleridge's conception of poetry and its proper subjects and Wordsworth's, Coleridge turns to the distinctions between a poem and poetry. Now, we're going to take these concepts slightly out of order, simply because it's easier to address poetry first and then come back and look at the poem, whereas Coleridge himself talks about what a poem is first and then looks at poetry. So we're going to look at this slightly out of the order that Coleridge intended. At the bottom of page 500, Coleridge turns to the question of what is poetry, and he tells us that this question has been anticipated in the preceding disquisition on fancy and the imagination. So clearly the distinction between the primary and secondary imagination and the fancy have something important to do with the definition of the concept of poetry. And he goes on to say, what is poetry is so nearly the same question with what is a poet that the answer to the one is involved in the solution to the other. So poetry, as opposed to the poem, which he has already discussed, but we haven't looked at yet, is closely related to the question of what is a poet. If we understand what makes a poet, we'll understand what makes poetry. On 501, it is a distinction resulting from the poetic genius itself, which sustains and modifies the images, thoughts, and emotions of the poet's own mind. The poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity with the subordination of its faculties to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. It's not clear whether Coleridge is referring to the primary or secondary imagination here, but it seems like he's actually melding them together. So the first part of this process, creating poetry, has to do with bringing the whole soul of man into activity. Since this is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation, of the infinite I Am, the whole soul of man in activity with the subordination of its faculties to each other according to the relative worth and dignity, I would argue that this is the primary imagination. And then the creation of the poem, this power first put into action by the will and understanding and retained under their irremissive though gentle and unnoticed control, reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities. Now this, I would say, is the secondary. And the reason I say that is because if you remember the definition of the secondary imagination is that it is under the control of the conscious will and that it dissolves and dissipates in order to unify. We've got the two components here. First, the soul of the poet coming into effect as the poet experiences poetic inspiration. And then the second characteristic of the poet is they turn that poetic inspiration into poetry, into the poem, using the secondary imagination, which is put in action by the will and retained under their irremissive, though gentle and unnoticed control. And this action of the will has the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities, of sameness with difference, of the general with the concrete, the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, a more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order, judgment ever awake and steady, self-possession with enthusiasm and feeling profound or vehement, while it blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial, still subordinates art to nature. Okay, so the secondary imagination, if you recall, dissolves and dissipates in order to unify. That seems to be the equivalent of what Coleridge is describing at this point. So even though he doesn't make a clear distinction here between the primary and the secondary imagination, and he seems to combine the two concepts, he does implicitly refer to his previous description, in which the whole soul of man coming into activity in the act of perception is the primary imagination, and then using the will to modify those to dissolve and dissipate so that there's a reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities is the secondary imagination. And that act is what takes poetry and produces the poem. That then brings us to the question of what is a poem. So let's go backwards, go back up, and go back to his discussion of the poem. Because now that we know how the poet works to create a poem, it'll be easier to understand what a poem is. Remember, in order to create a poem, the poet takes the inspiration that comes from the primary imagination, from the act of perception, and then uses the secondary imagination, controlled by the conscious will, to integrate that inspiration into a poem. So at the top of page 488, he's going to turn around and talk about what a poem is. He starts off by acknowledging that in a certain sense of the word poem, anything could be a poem merely because it is distinguished from prose by meter or rhyme or both conjointly. In this, the lowest sense of the word poem, even 30 days has September, April, June, and November, could qualify as a poem. But he doesn't believe that that's what a true poem is, and he will go on to explain what a true poem is. That's simply an issue of superficial form which doesn't create what a true poem is. Farther on down, he says that the poem is that species of composition which is opposed to works of science by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth, and from other species having this object in common with it, it is discriminated by proposing itself such delight from the whole as is compatible with distinct gratification from each component part. So this is where he introduces the idea of organic poetry. Poetry where you cannot distinguish between the whole and the component parts, because the component parts have been melded so completely into the whole that the whole gives joy and pleasure, and each component part contributes to that. So you're feeling this constant joy and pleasure throughout the poem as you experience the parts because of their interrelationship or integration into a whole. So let's skip on down. And he says, but if the definition sought for be that of a legitimate poem, I answer that it must be one the parts of which mutually support and explain each other, all in their proportion harmonizing with and supporting the purpose and known influences of metrical arrangement. Then he says, the philosophic critics of all ages coincide with the ultimate judgment of all countries in equally denying the praises of a just poem on one hand to a series of striking lines or distichs. In other words, just a simple set of things that look like poetry, that are doggerel, that simply rhyme or use meter, each of which absorbing the whole attention of the reader to itself disjoins it from its context and makes it a separate whole instead of a harmonizing part. So clearly, in order to be a poem, it can't do that. It must be a harmonizing part. And on the other hand, to an unsustained composition from which the reader collects rapidly the general result unattracted from the component parts. So it's not just simply a series of fragments that are not joined together. And it's not just simply something where the meaning of the whole can be abstracted from the parts, like a science text. Once you understand the meaning of a science text, it doesn't matter how it's said. A true poem is one where, a legitimate poem is one where all of the parts mutually support and explain each other, and all in their proportion harmonizing with and supporting the purpose and known influences of metrical arrangements. A true poem is this organic, coherent, mutually interrelated structure. And clearly this is a result of the secondary imagination. The secondary imagination taking all of the different elements of the poem and putting them together into an organic whole. As he says later, a poem of any length neither can be nor ought to be all poetry. So there's the distinction between a poem and poetry. And it's clear where the distinction comes from. The poetry comes from the primary imagination. The poem comes from the secondary. And the way the secondary works, he says, yet if a harmonious whole is to be produced, the remaining parts must be preserved in keeping with the poetry, and this can be no otherwise effected by a studied selection and artificial arrangement as will partake of one, though not the peculiar property of poetry. In other words, the poetry is produced by the primary imagination in the act of perception. The poem then is produced out of the secondary imagination, integrating that poetry with other elements and building it together into a coherent and interrelated whole. Finally, and briefly, I want to talk about the difference that Wordsworth and Coleridge had in their theories of the appropriate source of poetic language, both because this tells us something about the purpose of poetry for Coleridge, and also, and importantly, it shows the difference between Coleridge and Wordsworth that created this rift that lasted for many years. In chapter 17, although he had mentioned it briefly in chapter 14, Coleridge describes Wordsworth's theory of language and where his theory of language and Wordsworth's differ. At the top of page 502, he talks about the language of traditional poets who have, as he says, converted into mere artifices of connection or ornament, which constitute the characteristic falsity in the poetic style of the moderns, and that Wordsworth has pointed out the process by which this change was effected and the resemblances between the state into which the reader's mind is thrown by the pleasurable confusion of thought from the unaccustomed train of words and images, and that state which is induced by the natural language of impassioned feeling. So on the one hand, traditional poets have created this artificial diction which disconnects them from the sympathy of their readers, but also has turned into sort of a cliche. It ceases to impress because it's become so familiar. And so this is the falsity of representation of traditional poetic diction. And on the other hand, Wordsworth's original language, his new way of creating poetic language, has allowed him to evoke new senses of emotion and pleasure by showing things in unfamiliar ways. However, Coleridge differs from Wordsworth in where this original language comes from. He doesn't believe that this is necessarily language taken from the mouths of men in real life. He believes that the language taken from the mouths of men in real life belongs only to a certain portion of poetry. That would be a poetry which is representing those particular people, and that most people in real life don't speak in language that's appropriate to poetry, except in a sense that anyone would believe that language is appropriate to poetry. He's going to go on to specifically explain why low and rustic life is not appropriate. He says, "For first, if to communicate with an object implies such an acquaintance with it as renders it capable of being discriminately reflected on, the distinct knowledge of an uneducated rustic would furnish a very scanty vocabulary. The few things and modes of action requisite for his bodily conveniences would alone be individualized, while all the rest of nature would be expressed by a small number of confused general terms." In other words, they would be able to talk only about those things with which they were familiar, which would constitute only those things in their particular lives, and concepts or events or activities outside of their experience they wouldn't be able to talk about at all. Secondly, I deny that the words and combination of words derived from the objects with which the rustic is familiar, whether with distinct or confused knowledge, can be justly said to form the best part of language. And here's the important part. The best part of human language, properly so called, is derived from reflection on the acts of the mind itself. It is formed by a voluntary appropriation of fixed symbols to internal acts, to processes and results of the imagination, the greater part of which have no place in the consciousness of uneducated man. So the best language, according to Coleridge, comes from reflection upon mental processes. It comes from self-reflection, from thinking, from conceptualizing. And those people who are unaccustomed to think deeply in Coleridge's conception of rustic life would be poorly equipped to express themselves in language appropriate for poetry. So if we scroll down to page 503, he says, "For real, therefore, we must substitute an ordinary or a lingua communis. And thus we have proved is no more to be found in the phraseology of low and rustic life than in any other particular class. Omit the peculiarities of each, and the result, of course, must be common to all. And so what he's suggesting is, rather than low and rustic life, which is particular and peculiar to one social class but wouldn't represent the experiences, knowledge, or understanding of other social classes, instead of that particular kind of language, that we need a common language, which is something that's common to everyone. So what you're doing is excluding those things that are particular or specific to a certain kind of language and adopting a common language which is applicable to all, and which, Coleridge will argue, characterizes Wordsworth's poetry actually. In other words, Coleridge argues that Wordsworth doesn't practice what he preaches. He doesn't actually use the language of low and rustic life, but rather uses the lingua communis that Coleridge himself is advocating. In the next video, we're going to turn and look at one of Coleridge's poems. He has several great and famous poems, justifiably. Aside from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, he also has Frost at Midnight, which is a lovely poem, Kubla Khan, which is an interesting poem, which we'll talk very briefly about at the beginning. And we're going to look specifically at Dejection and Ode, which is a deeply imaginative poem about the failure of imagination.